The motorcycle flew through the air at 60 miles per hour. Inside the barbed wire fence of a Nazi prison camp, Steve McQueen gripped the handlebars, knowing that the next 3 seconds would either make cinema history or end his life. No one on the set of The Great Escape was breathing. September 1962. Bavaria, Germany. The production of The Great Escape was already over budget and behind schedule. Director John Sturges paced the muddy field, staring at the fence that had become his nightmare. The script called for the most dangerous motorcycle stunt ever attempted in a major Hollywood film, a jump over barbed wire, at high speed with cameras rolling. Every insurance company in Hollywood had said no. Every stunt coordinator had warned against it. Even the legendary Bud Ekins, one of the best motorcycle stunt riders in the world, had looked at the setup and shaken his head. But Steve McQueen stood beside his Triumph TR6 trophy, eyes fixed on that fence, and said the words that would change everything. "I'll do it myself." John approached him, exhaustion and worry etched on his face. "Steve, we've been through this. The insurance won't allow it. One mistake and you're either dead or crippled. And this entire production shuts down." Steve didn't take his eyes off the fence. "Then get Bud to wear my costume. Shoot it from behind. Nobody will know the difference." "That's not the point, Steve. You want to do it? I can see it in your eyes." Steve finally looked at John. "This is my character's defining moment. Captain Hiltz escaping on that bike. It's the whole reason we made this film. And you want me to stand here and watch someone else do it?" John sighed. He'd worked with difficult actors before, but Steve McQueen was different. It wasn't ego. It was something deeper, a need to prove something, maybe to the world, maybe to himself. "Steve, you have a wife. You have kids. Think about them." "I think about them every day," Steve said quietly, "and I think about the man I want them to see when they watch this film. Not someone playing it safe, someone who goes all the way." But what Steve didn't know was that the real danger hadn't even started yet. That night in his trailer, Steve couldn't sleep. He kept visualizing the jump, the approach, the acceleration, the moment the front wheel left the ground, the arc through the air, the landing, every variable, every possibility, every way it could go wrong. His wife, Neil, found him at 2 in the morning, sitting on the trailer steps, smoking a cigarette. "Can't sleep?" she asked, sitting beside him. "Just thinking about the jump." It wasn't a question. Neil knew. She'd been married to Steve long enough to recognize that look. The one he got before a race, before a dangerous scene, before any moment where everything hung in the balance. "They won't let me do it," Steve said. "Insurance won't cover it." "Then, maybe that's a sign." Steve looked at her. "A sign of what? That I should play it safe? That I should let someone else take the risk while I stand in front of the camera and pretend? Steve, you're not a stuntman. You're an actor. There's no shame in that." "Isn't there?" Steve stood up, agitation rising. "Neil, do you know what they say about me in this town? That I'm difficult, that I'm demanding, that I think I'm better than everyone else. And you know what? Maybe they're right, but it's not because I think I'm better. It's because I refuse to be less." Neil was quiet for a moment. Then she said something that would haunt Steve for the rest of his life. "Just promise me you'll come home." Steve couldn't make that promise, and they both knew it. The next morning, Steve found Bud Ekins in the stunt crews area. Bud was preparing his bike, checking the suspension, the tires, the chain. This was a man who understood machines, who respected the physics of what they were about to attempt. "Bud, we need to talk." Bud looked up. "If this is about you doing the jump, the answer is still no. John already asked me. I told him I'd do it, but you're not getting on that bike for the actual fence jump. What if we compromise?" "Compromise how?" Steve laid out his plan. He would do all the riding scenes, the chase through the countryside, the crashes through the barbed wire, the dramatic escape sequences. Everything except the actual fence jump that Bud would do, wearing Steve's costume, shot from angles that made it impossible to identify the rider. "But here's the thing," Steve added. "I want to practice the jump. I want to know I could do it if they'd let me." Bud studied him. You want to risk your life for practice, for something you'll never actually do on camera? I need to know, Steve said simply. Can you understand that? What Bud agreed to would change both their lives forever. They met before dawn the next day, away from the main production site. Just Steve, Bud, and 2 members of the crew who owed Steve favors. They'd set up a practice fence, lower than the real one, with hay bales on the landing side. We do this once, Bud said. One practice run. You get a feel for it. Then we never speak of it again. Deal? Steve nodded, already pulling on his helmet. The Triumph roared to life. Steve circled the field once, getting a feel for the terrain, the bike's response, the distance to the fence. Then he lined up for the approach. Remember, Bud shouted over the engine noise, it's all about the approach angle and speed. Too fast, and you'll overshoot the landing. Too slow, and you'll hit the fence. And whatever you do, don't lock up when you're in the air. Steve revved the engine once, twice. Then he released the clutch and accelerated toward the fence. The world narrowed to just the bike, the ground, the fence ahead, 30 miles per hour. 40, 50, the fence rushing closer. Steve's entire body tensed, then consciously relaxed. This was racing. This was flying. This was everything. The front wheel hit the ramp they'd built. The bike lifted. For one perfect moment. Steve McQueen and his Triumph were airborne, soaring over the practice fence, suspended between earth and sky. Then gravity returned. The landing, hard but controlled. The bike's suspension compressed, absorbed the impact. Steve kept it steady. Throttled down, brought the machine to a stop. He sat there for a moment, engine idling, hands still on the grips. Then he removed his helmet and looked back at the fence he'd just cleared. Bud jogged over. Well? Steve grinned. The first genuine smile Bud had seen from him in weeks. I can do it. If they'd let me, I could do it. But they won't. But I could. And somehow that was enough. July 18th, 1963. The day they would film the fence jump, the entire production had built to this moment. Multiple cameras positioned at different angles. The crew silent with tension. John Sturges checking and rechecking every detail. Bud Ekins stood beside the Triumph, now dressed in Steve's costume. Brown jacket, khaki pants, the outfit that would become iconic. He looked at Steve, standing nearby in his own clothes. You okay with this? Bud asked. Steve nodded. You're the professional. You'll make it look good. That's not what I asked. Steve was quiet for a moment. No, I'm not okay with it. I want to be the one on that bike. I want to be the one taking that risk. But I also want this film to exist. And if I crash, if I get hurt, it's over. So yeah, I'm okay with it. For the film. John called for positions. Bud mounted the bike. The cameras started rolling. And then, after all the preparation, all the arguments, all the tension, Bud Ekins made the jump. Perfect approach. Perfect arc. Perfect arc. Perfect landing. The crew erupted in applause. But Steve stood apart, watching, his face unreadable. But the real story was just beginning. After the shot wrapped, after the crew celebrated, after everyone else had gone home, Steve went back to the field. The fence still stood there, equipment being packed away around it. He walked up to it, touched the barbed wire, looked at the landing area where Bud had come down. John found him there. Steve, you okay? I could have done it. I know. No, you don't. You think this is about ego, about wanting to be the hero, but it's not. Steve turned to face him. When I was a kid, I had nothing. I lived in foster homes, youth centers, on the streets. I was nobody. And somewhere along the way, I learned that the only person I could depend on was myself. The only person who would push me to be better, to do more, to go further, was me. Steve. This fence, this jump, it's not about the stunt, it's about proving to myself that I'm not that scared kid anymore, that I can face anything, that I won't back down. John was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, You know what I see when I watch you on camera? I see someone who's already proven all of that. Every scene, every take. Every moment you're in front of that lens, you're showing the world exactly who Steve McQueen is, and it's remarkable. Years later, the truth would come out in interviews, in behind-the-scenes documentaries, in conversations among those who were there. Steve McQueen had done more of his own stunts on The Great Escape than anyone had realized. The crashes through the barbed wire, the high-speed chases, the dangerous riding sequences. All Steve. Just not the final fence jump. But there was one more secret, one that would only emerge decades after Steve's death. A crew member in an interview for a documentary in the 1990s revealed something shocking. On one of the practice days, away from the main cameras, Steve had convinced Bud to let him attempt the full-height fence, not the practice version, the actual final height. "We set it up," the crew member said. Bud was against it, but Steve wore him down, and Steve made that jump, cleared it by a foot. Perfect landing. We all swore we'd never tell anyone because if the insurance company found out, the entire production would have been shut down. When this revelation emerged, film historians debated its truth. Some said it was impossible, that such a thing couldn't have been kept secret. Others pointed to Steve's known personality, his need to prove himself, his willingness to risk everything for authenticity. The truth of what really happened would shock everyone. Robert Reloya, the assistant director on The Great Escape, finally confirmed it in a 2005 interview. Yeah, Steve did it. One morning, very early, before the regular crew arrived, just a handful of us there, he wanted to know if he could do it. And he did. We never told John. We never told the studio. We especially never told the insurance company. But Steve needed that for himself, to know he was capable. Was it reckless? The interviewer asked. Robert thought for a moment. Reckless? Maybe. But that was Steve. He didn't just act brave characters. He needed to be brave. To test himself constantly, that jump, whether anyone ever saw it or not, mattered to him more than the final cut of the film. This revelation added a new layer to understanding Steve McQueen. The fence jump in The Great Escape became one of the most iconic moments in cinema history. Audiences worldwide watched that sequence and believed they were seeing Steve McQueen make that jump. And in a way they were, because even though Bud Ekins was on the bike for the filmed version, Steve had already made the jump for himself, to prove to himself that he could. But courage always comes with a price. During the filming of The Great Escape, Steve pushed himself beyond reasonable limits. He crashed multiple times, bruised ribs, sprained wrist, countless cuts and abrasions. The production doctor saw him almost daily. Neil watched her husband's obsession with growing concern. "You're going to seriously hurt yourself," she warned after one particularly bad crash. "It's just bumps and bruises. Steve, you have 2 children. You have a family. What if one of these crashes is more than just bumps and bruises?" He had no answer for that, because the truth was he'd thought about it. Every time he got on that bike, every time he attempted something dangerous, a voice in his head whispered the possibilities. Broken bones, paralysis, death. But another voice, louder and more insistent, demanded he do it anyway. But then something happened that changed his perspective forever. One afternoon, Steve's daughter Terry visited the set. She was young, maybe 8 years old, watching her father work. They were filming one of the motorcycle scenes, a relatively simple sequence where Steve's character rode through the German countryside. But Steve being Steve, he pushed it, took a turn faster than planned. The bike slid out from under him. He managed to stay upright, but it was close, too close. When he came back to the starting position, he saw Terry's face, white, terrified. She'd seen her invincible father almost crash. And in that moment, Steve saw himself through her eyes, not as a hero proving his courage, but as her father risking his life for a movie. That evening, he found Terry sitting alone. "Hey, kiddo, you okay?" She nodded, but wouldn't look at him. "Terry, talk to me. Are you going to die?" she asked, her voice small. Steve felt his heart break. "What? No, sweetheart, I'm not going to die. But you almost crashed today, and Mom says you crash all the time." Steve knelt down to her level. "Listen to me. Yes, what I do is sometimes dangerous. But I'm very careful, and I have people looking out for me. I'm not going to die, Terry. I promise." It was a promise he couldn't guarantee, but it was a promise his daughter needed to hear, and it was a promise that would, for the rest of the filming, make him slightly more cautious. Not much. He was still Steve McQueen, but enough. When The Great Escape was released in July 1963, it became an instant classic. The motorcycle chase sequence became one of the most celebrated action sequences in film history. Audiences around the world watched Steve McQueen's character attempt that desperate escape, culminating in the iconic fence jump. They didn't know that two different riders were involved. They didn't know about the insurance battles, the practice jumps, the secret attempt at the full fence. They just saw what appeared to be pure, reckless courage, a man on a motorcycle, refusing to be caged. And in a way, that was exactly right. Because even though Bud Ekins made the filmed jump, the spirit of that sequence was all Steve McQueen. His need for freedom, his refusal to accept limitations, his willingness to risk everything for authenticity. Critics praised the film. "Steve McQueen is born to be on a motorcycle," wrote one reviewer. "He embodies American independence and rebellious spirit." Another called the fence jump the greatest stunt sequence in modern cinema. Steve read the reviews with mixed feelings. Pride in the film's success, but also a quiet frustration that he couldn't tell the full story, that he couldn't say, "I made that jump too. Maybe not on camera, but I did it." Years later, the truth would come out in the most unexpected way. In 1980, shortly before Steve's death, he gave his final in-depth interview. The journalist, knowing this might be the last chance, asked about The Great Escape and the fence jump. "Did you really do it yourself?" the journalist asked. Steve was quiet for a long time. Then he smiled. That iconic Steve McQueen smile. Does it matter? It matters to the story, to history. "Here's what I'll tell you," Steve said. "That jump, whether I was on the bike or Bud was on the bike, represented something I believed in. That you don't accept limits. That you push yourself. That you find out what you're capable of. So did I make the jump? In every way that matters. Yes. I made that jump every day of filming. Every time I got on that bike. Every time I pushed a scene further than it needed to go. That fence wasn't just barbed wire and posts. It was every limitation anyone ever tried to put on me, and I cleared it." The journalist pressed further. "But physically, were you on that bike for the actual filmed jump over the fence?" Steve looked directly into the camera. "Buy a ticket and watch the movie. Make up your own mind." It was vintage McQueen, neither confirming nor denying, letting the legend remain a legend. After Steve's death in 1980, Bud Ekins finally told the complete story. Yes, he had made the filmed jump, but Steve had done almost everything else. And yes, Steve had successfully completed the jump in practice, at full height, without cameras rolling. He needed to know he could do it. Bud explained in a 1985 interview. That was Steve. It wasn't enough to have someone tell him he couldn't do something. He had to test it himself. And when he made that practice jump, when he cleared that fence, the look on his face, I've never seen anything like it. Pure joy, pure freedom. "Was he the best motorcycle rider you ever worked with?" the interviewer asked. "He was one of the best riders, period," Bud said, "professional or otherwise. What made him special wasn't just skill. It was fearlessness combined with control. He would push right to the edge, but he knew where the edge was. That's rare, very rare." The revelation sparked renewed interest in The Great Escape. New generations discovered the film. Film schools analyzed the motorcycle sequences. Stunt coordinators studied how they'd achieved those shots. And always the question, what would have happened if the insurance company had said yes? If Steve had been allowed to make that jump on camera? But the real legacy was something nobody expected. In 2013, on the 50th anniversary of The Great Escape, a group of professional stunt riders decided to recreate the fence jump, using the same model Triumph, the same fence height, the same approach. They wanted to honor both Steve McQueen and Bud Ekins by showing exactly how difficult and dangerous that jump had been. 6 professional riders attempted it. 2 crashed on the approach. 1 hit the fence. 2 cleared it but crashed on landing. Only 1 made it successfully. "Now I understand," said the rider who succeeded. "What made that jump so special? It wasn't just the difficulty. It was doing it in 1963, with 1963 equipment and safety standards, with the pressure of an entire production depending on it, with all of Hollywood watching. What Bud Akins did was extraordinary, and the fact that Steve McQueen even attempted it in practice shows a level of courage that's almost incomprehensible by today's standards." This modern perspective added yet another layer to the legend. In an age of CGI and green screens, of safety regulations and insurance requirements, the Great Escape fence jump stood as a testament to a different era, when risks were real, when stunts were practical, when actors like Steve McQueen put their lives on the line for authenticity. Steve McQueen died on November 7, 1980, at the age of 50, cancer, the same disease that had taken his mother. In his final months, weak and dying, he rarely spoke about his films or his career. But one day his son Chad visited and found him watching The Great Escape. The fence jump sequence came on. Steve watched it silently, tears in his eyes. "You okay, Dad?" Chad asked. Steve nodded. "You know, all these years people have argued about who was on that bike. Was it me? Was it Bud? Does it even matter? What do you think?" Steve was quiet for a long moment. "I think that fence represented something bigger than a stunt. It represented the choice we all face. Do we stay safe? Do we accept the boundaries others set for us? Or do we jump? Do we risk everything to be free? That's what that sequence means to me. Not who was on the bike, but what the jump represents." "And you jumped," Chad said. Steve smiled. "Every chance I got." The motorcycle flew through the air at 60 miles per hour. Inside the barbed wire fence of a Nazi prison camp, a rider gripped the handlebars, suspended in that perfect moment between captivity and freedom. The bike cleared the fence. The rider landed safely. The cameras captured it all. Was it Steve McQueen? Was it Bud Akins? The truth is, it was both. Bud's skill, Steve's spirit, together creating one of the most iconic moments in cinema history. But more than that, it was a lesson about courage, about pushing beyond limits, about the willingness to risk everything for something that matters. Steve McQueen made that jump. Maybe not on camera, maybe not for the final cut, but he made it. In practice, in spirit, in the way he lived his entire life. And decades later, whenever someone watches The Great Escape, whenever that motorcycle soars over that fence, Steve McQueen is making that jump again, forever suspended in that moment of perfect freedom, forever showing us what it means to refuse to be caged. The stunt that almost killed the legend became the stunt that made him immortal. There's a fence in everyone's life, a barrier that says you can't, a limitation that seems impossible to overcome. Steve McQueen's fence was literal barbed wire. Yours might be different. A career change, a dream you've been afraid to pursue, a fear you've never faced. Steve McQueen looked at his fence and made a choice. He could play it safe, let someone else take the risk, accept the boundaries, or he could jump. He jumped, and in doing so, he taught us all something essential, that the only limits that matter are the ones we accept. What's your fence, and when will you jump?